Hey everybody, it's Andrew with Natural State Horticare here. I just want to take a brief moment to make a video about the proper way to prune a crepe myrtle to encourage the health and also reduce disease and pest issues. I'm sure we're all familiar with scale. It plagues crepe myrtles all over the state, and pruning has a lot to do with that. So we're going to do a couple things here to kind of get this tree back into shape. I've seen much worse crepe myrtles than the one we have here behind me, but this is a good example of one that's pretty well pruned but could still use a little love. There's a lot of crossing branches on this tree, and there's also some limbs that are outside of the angle that are going to promote healthy growth. So what I mean by that is when we have rainfall or ice, even when the tree's in bloom and it has foliage on it, you'll notice your crepe myrtles tend to bow and get pulled down to the ground. That does two things. Is number one, it causes a lot more shade if you're trying to grow turf grass underneath it, like in this case. And it also eventually ends up making your tree sprawl out and get wider and wider and wider over time, and that becomes stressful for the tree. And so we're gonna try to avoid that stress by pruning it properly. So before we get started pruning on this tree, I wanna take a second to walk around and kind of show some examples of the things I mentioned. This branch here is kind of one of the perfect examples of one that's kind of outside of the angle of departure that we prefer. So this one here is leaving this tree out from the main stalks and comes way out here. And so this is going to be that first branch that wants to lean back whenever this thing gets wet and heavy. So this one can go. It's not going to do anything other than re-centralize the canopy and reduce the stress on the tree. The tree's going to spend a lot less energy growing these extraneous branches and a lot more energy on the heart of the plant itself. It will result in a healthier plant over time. Another example where we're going to kind of parse this tree out as we go, and it will be a bit of a work in progress, and we don't know exactly every branch we're going to prune when we start, but we kind of work our way through the process with the premise in mind of narrowing the canopy and reducing the crossing branches. This is another one that's kind of on the fence, but does need to go. So when you're dealing with a branch like this that is kind of intertwined at the base, it will be tough to prune. It'll be tough to get in there and actually make a clean cut, but the premise is always to bring it back to the nearest node when you prune. So for example, on this tree here, you're gonna come all the way down this branch and you're gonna wanna get as close to the base of this branch as possible. Where this particular branch gets complicated is where it meets the other trunk down here at the very base. And so we'll get a nice clean cut as close as we can. So we will leave a nice cut here, but we'll get as close as we can. And I'll show you an example that'll be much easier to kind of describe. So for example, on this branch here, if I'm pruning this one and I want this branch in particular to stay where it is, so it can be this way oftentimes where the main branch comes off and it splits, and one branch is outside of the angle of departure and the other is not. And so we want to remove this one but not this one. And so what we're going to do in that scenario is we're going to prune at the nearest node and try to keep the angle nice and smooth at about a 45-degree angle away from the branch itself that we're trying to keep. And that way we create a nice clean cut that's going to heal properly on this tree. The next step, once we accomplish the removal of a lot of these angle of departure branches, is then going to be to look up into the canopy and really determine where we have crossing branches that are rubbing against each other. And I'm sure if we look hard enough, we can find a lot of examples. So it'll be hard to kind of demonstrate here, but this branch here comes up and across this branch here. If you notice, if I move one, they both move. That is a recipe for disease and pest because you're going to wear down the bark, and then that just creates an opportunity for disease and pests to get in there and infiltrate. But so far, that's the premise, and we're going to go about executing that premise, and we're going to film that for you guys so you can see kind of how we go about it. Okay, so behind me, I have a few examples of what not to do. This is what most people refer to as crape murdering, and it actually leaves a lot of area and surface area and nooks and crannies for pests and disease, especially scale insects that create scale, like mealybugs, woolly aphids, to get in there, and they make a little home, and they're almost impossible to get insecticides down into without using systemic insecticides that are pricey, and they take a long time to clean that plant up again. So what we want to do by properly pruning is to just eliminate that gnarled effect that happens at the top of the branches, and therefore reduce the environment and the home that is created for pests and disease. Okay, now it's time to take a closer look at exactly what I was talking about with crape murdering and exactly how it damages the plant. There's a couple things specifically that are going on with this plant that we're going to avoid with the other plant that we talked about pruning it properly. So this one has, first of all, it's been pulled apart over time. You can tell that these branches were allowed to get wide, and then they were pulled down over time, and you see the base of this plant here is much, much wider than it is on the larger plants up the hill. So this is a good example of what happens to a crape myrtle when you prune it in the same area over and over again. It gets very gnarled, very just unhealthy looking, and this one doesn't particularly have a ton of scale on it, but it's absolutely unhealthy. If you get a shot of this down this branch here, you're gonna see a lot of canker disease. So this is a really prime example of a tree under immense stress. So anytime you see a crape myrtle with these little nodules up and down the stalks, you're talking about a sick tree that's not gonna perform well, it's not gonna look good, and it's all comes back to years and years and years of improper pruning techniques that could have easily been avoided.